3 years ago, I asked a group of people to, one by one, enter a dark room with 16 loudspeakers, what I would call a sonic womb. I connected them to a device resembling a lie detector, and I fixed a camera to record their facial expressions. I then asked them to listen to the following, paying close attention to the sensations felt and any emotions or memories triggered. Now, let's see how you feel. At this point, you might be aware of some surprising physical sensations, like blood rushing to your cheeks, or dizziness, or chills down your spine. Or you might just be busy wondering, what kind of torture is this? Who am I, and what ethics board approved this? Glasgow School of Art. But please, allow me to explain myself. When I don't do sonic or psychological research, I'm a cello player, and I've always been fascinated by the power of sound to trigger a wide range of emotions and sensations, whether that's awe in orchestral recitals, hedonic bliss in dance clubs, or sickening fright watching Japanese horror movies. I have had music pull me out of a debilitating depression, and it has helped me induce catharsis many times. To help me to feel my distress more deeply and understand it, so that I can demystify the anxiety and eventually overcome it. But what is catharsis? Well, in philosophy and psychoanalytic theory, catharsis is defined as the purging of pity and fear, the shedding of trauma-induced pain, an unsuppressed energetic reaction, maybe triggered by watching a Greek tragedy. Horror or tearjerker movies are some of our most common outlets for catharsis in the modern world, and music is used for mood regulation by many. So if we need to ruminate in a depressive state, we might listen to Radiohead. Or if you want to feel fragile, then angry, and eventually empowered, I really recommend Beyoncé's Lemonade. It's worked for me. This is catharsis. It's what we feel when pain eventually goes away, through the release of tension and coming to terms with grief. If we refuse to acknowledge our pain, or give ourselves time to grieve, and reach a catharsis, then we're susceptible to post-traumatic stress disorder, a fragile, volatile state in which intrusive memories can burst into our consciousness, randomly or triggered by sound. So if the trauma is not fully processed, if we distract ourselves from the pain, delaying a catharsis, this can cause a more prolonged harm, a slow burn of anxiety and depression. But today, I'd like to tell you about a new way in which you can use music for therapy, to trigger catharsis and to better understand and live with anxiety. You might already retreat away from city noise or your colleagues' chatter by plugging in your headphones with a chill-out playlist at the ready. The reason why we do this is so that we can control our sound environment. But this makes out that the everyday soundscape is something to be seen as ugly, anxiety-inducing, something to be blocked out. Rather than chill out, my most transformative playlist I use every day is called Fierce, and it features high-energy, emotionally intense power ballads from Beyoncé, or Queen, RuPaul Charles, even James Bond themes, or the noisy, abrasive techno-metal hybrids of Death Grips. These musics are all quite extreme and hyperbolic, and they synthetically induce exaggerated emotions at times when I'm unsettled or I'm numb. Maybe you listen to Adele when you need to cry it out, or Philip Glass when you study. Music and sound has been used manipulatively for millennia to ensure social cohesion and elicit religious awe with the hymns of churches or the prayer calls emanating from mosques. However, sound is also essential for capitalism. It's used to sell us products. Think of those perfume advertisements that rely on eroticized sensuous breaths or hypnotic music. Sounds also make us empathize with a fictional character. So in mainstream narratives, frightening sound effects like gunshots, lightning strikes, or tigers snarling convey a fatal threat to the character. And then musical scores with pounding heartbeats and breathy string instruments remind us of both the characters and our own body's fragility. Therapists know it too, that sound can be used to frighten. War veterans might play a visual virtual reality game to reenact a traumatizing combat scenario, usually with a few gunshot sounds or ambiances, but rarely with sound as the focus. Therapists also use sound to heal in palliative care. Arvo Parr's tabula rasa has been requested by many terminal AIDS patients. Now, what is an emotion? What you felt earlier as you listened to that soundscape was caused by your heartbeat clocking into rhythms or intakes of breath at confusing or shocking sounds, but also a rapid cascade of neurochemicals, mostly adrenaline, cortisol, strangely enough dopamine, one that's associated with bliss, or even prolactin, a soothing neurochemical induced by listening to sad music. Your body might have involuntarily triggered a fight or flight response, like this one, first evolved when humans fended for themselves in the wild, and they had to decide whether to fight or flee from a fatal threat. Perhaps even triggered by the sound of a branch snapping revealing an approaching predator. But even when there are no life-threatening or drastic traumatic events in our lives, we catastrophize everyday stress if we don't take time to press pause, to process unresolved anxiety. Some sounds trigger instinctive reactions, whereas others are learned, conditioned responses. An example of an automatic response is how the high-frequency scraping of nails on a chalkboard activate the brainstem and make our toes curl, or how a loud shock sound following a silence makes us jump. However, we each carry a collection of personally resonant sounds with learned associations. So in my experiment, one participant reimagined her memory of, luckily, a non-fatal childhood house fire when she heard the sound of flames raging. And another even felt pain in the ankle where stitches had previously been removed when they heard the sound of scissors snipping. So even if the sound itself might not seem particularly abrasive, we can easily be conditioned to react both mentally and physically to seemingly innocuous sound. For example, we might be conditioned to associate the sound of a slamming door with an intensely upsetting argument, or the whizzing of bike wheels with an approaching mugger. That's one of mine, unfortunately. This is like Pavlov's dog associating the sound of a bell with the approach of its dinner. So the dog would salivate even when it was just the bell sound on its own. Every time we hear the sound of a slamming door, we might get an intrusive memory of that upsetting argument, unless we desensitize ourselves to the sounds by repeating them or pairing them with pleasant, harmonious music. This soundscape exposure experience was designed to let the participant tune into their own emotions. There was a persistent instruction for them to evaluate the strength of each of their reactions after every soundscape. Now, as pedantic and repetitive as that sounds, this was actually a form of psychoeducation, that anxiety is temporary, and our emotional state is easily influenced. As fleetingly as anxiety can be induced, it can recede, maybe even replaced with bliss in a matter of seconds. The environment as a whole is unique. An extended 2-hour session in which the participants listened attentively in nervous anticipation, wondering what would happen next, surrendering to the unknown. No screens, no distractions, no interruptions, just the sound and their reactions. You might wonder, surely this has been done before. Indeed, there are numerous exposure therapies, such as the visual virtual reality games or augmented reality holograms of phobias, or even a social anxiety sufferer might be led to a shopping centre with their therapist. However, there's a lack of purely sound-based exposure therapy, especially one which immerses the listener in a constantly moving womb of real-world sound, blended with emotionally manipulative music. Sonic or music therapy at the moment is mostly used for distraction or as a painkiller. However, if an anxiety sufferer relies on calming music to distract themselves from a panic attack, then this only works as a temporary pacifier, and it perpetuates the cyclical fear of fear, catastrophizing the anxiety symptoms. Rather than using sound to numb pain or distract, I actually took the opposite approach. So I induced temporary discomfort for a long-lasting positive impact. Now, I decided to make a lot of work for myself to construct my own soundscapes rather than using existing music. And I locked myself in this dark, windowless sound lab for 6 months, panning each individual sound around the room. And I collected many sounds, recording in diverse locales like the vibrant natural sounds of waterfalls and geysers erupting in Iceland, or the densely populated ambiences in New York City. I combed through entire sound effects libraries to extract anxiety-eliciting sounds that were out with my reach, because I don't have a collection of guns or work in a factory. So I also commissioned vocal performances and composed cello and synthesized music. I even asked this dancer if he could scream and release terrifying groans underneath this huge bridge just along the road, which certainly gave a few cyclists a fright. You could say I got my own back. To make these soundscapes even more unsettling, I panned the sounds around the room, veering between realism and hyperreality. So for realism, if I wanted to make the listener feel like they were being crept up on, I would send the sound of footsteps from behind them. Or an absurd scenario I simulated was that the listener was standing in a hot frying pan and the sound of bubbling oil would emerge from the floor. Yeah, it was a long 6 months in there. I used questionnaires to track the participants' subjective emotional responses. But what if participants didn't remember every single sound that triggered an emotion? Well, remember that device resembling a lie detector I told you about earlier? These sensors allowed me to map spikes in sweat secretion, gasps or pauses in breathing rates, and rises in pulse rates directly onto the timeline of sounds, so I could identify the most potent ones. So what happened to the participants? Did they feel better emotionally? Not immediately. Negative emotions increased by 4% immediately after hearing the soundscapes. But after participants were given time to recharge, move on from their catharsis, and put the psychoeducation into practice for a week, negative emotions dropped by 12% from their original emotional state 1 month before the experiment. So the long-term emotional drop in negative emotion was 3 times the short-term induction of negative emotion on the day. The long-term benefit outweighed the short-term distress. What about catharsis? Well, 4 participants explicitly reported a sense of resolution of underlying fear, trauma, or grief as a result of the soundscape exposure. Essentially, they'd experienced catharsis. Another sign of catharsis was that tears were triggered in this sound lab several times, including one instance where hospital sounds imaginatively launched a participant back to the ward where their grandparent passed away. Remarkably, the participant reported that this was a warm experience of grief. When hundreds of sounds are layered, there's a high chance that at least a few would resonate with each participant's personal histories. And a significant reflection on the unique approach of soundscape exposure as a passive and meditative experience, rather than the social pressure of having to verbalize quite ambiguous emotions in talk therapy, was that one participant reported, often talking to people about themes of grief can involve judgment, whereas with sound, that's absent, which makes it easier and safer. So, remember those physical sensations from the fight or flight response? Blood rushing to your cheeks, dizziness, chills down your spine. Chills down the spine can be triggered by both musical bliss or high-pitched abrasive sounds. The same sensation can be triggered by either a positive or a negative stimulus. So you could say that there are some anxiety symptoms that could maybe be perceived as positive. But we all know, in our everyday lived experience, anxiety symptoms seem invasive, surprising, distressing. However, they are vital. They're our body's way of telling us that something needs to change, that we need to press pause, stop running away from unresolved traumas and uncomfortable emotions to confront our fears. Sometimes we need help to feel more deeply, and immersive soundscapes fused with emotionally manipulative music can provide this kick. Now, I'm going to say something which may seem like a very grim conclusion. No one can ever be cured from anxiety. It's an instinct that keeps us alive. What we can do is educate ourselves about the benefits of emotional immersion, to understand our anxiety and learn from it. Use it to improve our lives and discover just how resilient we can be. So if you're currently lost in a monotonous looping cycle of anxiety or depression, instead of tuning out, why not tune into the noise, even amplify it, so you can understand it better? The effects might surprise you. Thank you.